Hello to everyone. Welcome to the Tropical Forest Alliance community webinar. My name is Felipe Carazo. I'm the head of public sector engagement for the Alliance. We want to have a rich discussion today, to share with you the latest on the demand side policy measures, processes that are being crafted within the EU, the European Union, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom, with the aim of protecting and restoring forests. We have a very rich program. We would invite you to help us out by keeping your lines muted. There's the question and answers function is disabled. So if you have any questions, just please post that in the chat, and we will have a follow-up after the webinar. We want to hear from you and have an active dynamic that goes beyond this session as part of how we can keep our community active and engaged. The webinar will be recorded, and information with the link will be distributed to all registrants. Now, before we jump into the content, we want to share with you a quick question, a quick poll, just to have an idea of your level of awareness with this subject that is going to be discussed. So I will invite my colleague Jennifer to pop up the call, and please take a few seconds just to answer that question, and we will share the results and take it from there into the discussion. I guess we can, Jennifer, I don't know if we are going to close the question in a few seconds and just showcase the results. Now we have the results. So we have, the question is, how familiar are you with the demand side policy measures that have been crafted, discussed in many downstream markets of commodity supply chains? 11% of you are unaware of these measures. There's a basic awareness of the measures for most of, half of the community in place in the call. There's a strong understanding, one fourth of the community, and there's a deep understanding. So we have a very nice allocation of knowledge with a nice curve, I would even say, and hopefully we can have those that have deep understanding contributing with good questions and inputs that allows us to educate or bring up to speed to those that are digesting the input. That's the purpose of our session. For that, if we can see the next slide, we have a very fantastic and knowledgeable crew. Next slide, Jess, please. That is going to share with you today. We've divided the session in three tracks. First, a series of keynote speakers, starting with Ms. Helge Sittler, who is the Deputy Head of Unit for the DG Environment of the European Commission. She'll give us a quick glimpse on the EU process, followed by Emily Fripp, the Managing Director of EFECA. EFECA is a very technical and strategic partner of the United Kingdom government in the run-up of the UK regulatory effort. And followed by Luke Pritchard from the Women Business Coalition. Luke has been engaging in building bridges that can help speed out the discussion on the US Congress of this type of regulations. And finally, from the House, from the TFA Secretariat team, Dr. Chuhan Zhu, who is our head of China Nature Initiatives, who's going to explain a bit of the process that's shaping up within the context of a national strategy in China. That block will give us insight of of how this process are being shaped up, and we might then jump into a rich discussion, through a panel discussion that will allow us to have some reactions to what this means and the opportunities and challenges that stakeholders face, especially companies, for which we will have Dr. Liz Wilkes, who is the EU Director of Sustainability and Stakeholder Engagement for APP, a company from the Cinemas Group, and then Ilenia Maitino, who is the Group Public Policy and Manager for Sustainability of Ferrero. They're going to have this interesting corporate perspective within the context of these regulatory framework discussions. And Joel Brunner, who as Country Director of Solidaridad in Colombia, brings us a perspective from the ground, from the upstream of the supply chains, and also looking into how we can make sure that these frameworks can address issues such as stakeholder engagement and on-the-ground connections for activity. Finally, having Helge Sittler in the space and she being really immersed in how our regulatory framework process gets shaped up within a multilateral policy body such as the European Commission, it's a delight, and therefore we're going to give Ms. Sittler some time to just have some closing remarks for the event. With that said, let me jump into the keynote speakers and invite Ms. Sittler to just jump in and share some insight on the EU process. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Good afternoon to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and we very much appreciate this focus on, well, sort of a comparison of demand-side measures in different key markets, because I think we're all aware that the consumption and production in those key markets is really a key factor in driving deforestation globally, and so it's upon all of us really to take on responsibility and to address what we can in reducing our impact in that regard. So I had to step in on this presentation relatively short notice, so I apologize in advance because there are a couple of small mistakes when we put together the slides, but we will fix them before they go to the participants. Next slide, please. So I'm here to give you a short overview of the key features of our regulation proposal. I mean, probably all of you are aware, the proposal came out in November of last year. And we really think it's a quite pioneering proposal that we are proud of. And we've been trying to balance in this proposal ambition that is urgently needed with implementability, and so that is certainly interesting to hear reactions later on, but I would like to highlight some of the key features of the proposal. If you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So our main objective, as I said before, is to reduce the EU's contribution to deforestation worldwide, and with that, of course, to our greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. So really coming to this proposal very much from the environmental perspective and our core environmental ambitions on climate and biodiversity. But at the same time, we also believe that our demand-side measures can really incentivize a global move towards deforestation-free supply chains and help drive the consumer demand for deforestation-free commodities. The key innovative features, and we will hear a bit more about them in a second, is that our proposal moves beyond legality, the approach that we've been using for many years in the EU timber regulation and in the voluntary partnerships agreement. And we feel it's time to go beyond legality and to really look at sustainability. And we believe we need a universal or a generally applicable definition of what is deforestation free, so that this is independent from national definitions. I will explain a little bit more on this in a second. The second key feature is really the strict traceability requirements for the supply chains, coupled with strict due diligence requirements for all operators and traders that are not SMEs. And that really goes through the whole supply chain, going back to the plot of land where the commodity was produced. And the third element, a benchmarking system for countries based on objective, transparent, scientific criteria that will help really both operators to understand where they have to pay particular attention in the context of their due diligence, and that helps also authorities to focus their effort if it comes to monitoring and enforcement. Next slide, please. So the scope of the proposal covers 6 key commodities: palm oil, soy, wood, cattle, cocoa, and coffee, and some particularly relevant derived products such as leather, chocolate, furniture. Very importantly, also from a WTO perspective, but really also because we feel we need to have a non-discriminatory regime, is that the requirements of the regulation apply both to domestically produced products for the internal market or for export, and for imported commodities and derived products. We have a quite innovative approach, and we feel it's best to move in a way step by step. So the proposal is building on a progressive scope. So we start with this commodities and the selection of derived products. But the idea is to review the scope regularly, to look at deforestation patterns, and then to be able to adjust regularly if need be, maybe to expand or just to be able to react, and to keep this really as a regulation that addresses the key drivers of deforestation. The cutoff date that is relevant, so at what point in time there must not be deforestation on the land from which the commodity stems, is the 31st of December 2020. And the background to that is the target on deforestation in the SDGs, where there was a commitment to halt deforestation by the end of 2020. We all know that we are not there, unfortunately, but it was a point in time when all countries had committed to halt deforestation. So it's not coming out of the blue that this is something that needs to be addressed. And it's also our ambition not to go backwards too much in time, because we feel it's more important. We cannot bring forests back, but we need to focus on avoiding that in the future there is deforestation for agricultural production. So therefore, we focus more on the future, a relatively recent cutoff date. Next slide, please. The mandatory due diligence is really at the core of this proposal. Only products that are both legal and deforestation-free would be allowed to be placed on the market or to be exported from the market. And very importantly, they need to be covered by a due diligence statement that operators have to provide. This is very important for transparency. This will be hosted in an information system that the Commission will set up, so that there's really access for all enforcement authorities and a general availability of data. And so obligations can be checked, compliance with obligations for operators can be checked. So we are looking both at legality, as we have been doing before under the EU timber regulation, but we also look at deforestation-free commodities and products. And we propose to use here definitions building on international work, in particular under the UN, under the Food and Agriculture Organization, so that we have a certain internationally agreed basis for what is deforestation, and hence what is a deforestation-free product. We also include forest degradation, because that is very important. Deforestation is a feature that is particularly prevalent in tropical countries, but really our proposal aims at addressing deforestation globally. And forest degradation can have, of course, a very big impact also on reducing climate change mitigation, capacity of forests, etc. So by including that, we really make sure we capture all the phenomena that affect forests negatively and that are occurring globally, not just in tropical countries. Our main obligations are applicable to operators and all traders that are not SMEs. And we really aim, as I said before, to go back all the way through the supply chain to the plot of land where the commodity was produced. This sounds very ambitious. It's actually quite feasible, and there are already many examples of supply chains where this is being done. We propose to use, in particular, geolocation. This is quite simple data that can be found via any smartphone on just the core geolocation of the plot of the land. This data would be included in the due diligence statement together with other information, and therefore there's a whole possibility to, in a very transparent manner, check where a commodity stems from. Thank you. Next slide, please. The third key element is, as I mentioned, the benchmarking system. The idea is to assign risk of deforestation to countries or parts thereof. All countries would start at a standard risk level. Then the Commission would do the benchmarking. It's a system we are using also, for example, in the context of IUU fishing. And that would indicate, based on a number of criteria that are transparent, and of course there would be consultation of the countries concerned about the proposed ranking, to identify low-risk countries and to identify particular high-risk countries. Our ambition is certainly not to end up with a very long list of high-risk countries. Rather, we see the system as a strong incentive to have everyone at a standard or ideally low risk. And the obligations for standard or high risk for operators are the same. What changes in a high-risk country is that there's increased attention by the enforcement authorities, so more checks to see what is really coming on the market. For low-risk countries and products stemming from these countries, there's a simplified due diligence. We also foresee in our proposal a minimum level of inspections for member states. That is a bit of a lesson learned from the EU timber regulation, where we have noted, and the fitness track has noted, quite different enforcement levels. So we try to get a certain minimum common approach here. The same goes for penalties to be foreseen in the national systems, with a bit more specificity of what should make them effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. And then a very important element is really what is proposed as a legal obligation for enhanced cooperation with and support for producer countries. It's really quite strongly worded in the proposal because it is, of course, a key feature. It is clear that these requirements also can be challenging for countries initially to set up systems that allow them to comply with. But there is enhanced support available. This is through a range of measures that we are working very closely with our colleagues from the International Partnerships Department. These can be through forest partnerships, but this can also be other support measures in the context of support for a sustainable agriculture. We have very active engagement already. I just mentioned, for example, the cocoa dialogues with African countries that are very active and a very, very constructive forum for dialogue and for assessing the needs of countries, and then to really target support. So this is something that we aim to enhance further in discussions, of course, with the countries. And it's also clear that this is not just the EU and the support coming from the Commission side, but this is really also the support coming from our member states. very much a joint Team Europe approach here that will bring, if taken together, really significant support measures in addition to what is already happening for producer countries. Next slide, please. So this is really just a brief overview. Looking at the timeline, as I said, we presented this in November 21. We are privileged to have a very ambitious French presidency at the moment, who really has identified this file and the regulation proposal as one of their priorities. So we are in a very active and high-speed process in Council. The presidency aims for a general approach in June 22. Sorry, there's a typo here. So we hope this will be feasible, and as I said, the schedule is high pace and ambitious. At the same time, the work is also very active in the European Parliament. We've seen already opinions from trade and the agricultural side, and the opinion of the main rapporteur, Mr. Hansen, is about to come out. And he is aiming at a plenary vote in September. So if things go well, there will be then afterwards the trilogues between the Council, so the representation of the EU member states and the Parliament. And this, if things go well, should allow for agreement before the end of the year under the Czech presidency in the second half of the year. Thank you very much. I leave it at that for now, and then I'm curious to hear the feedback. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Hitler, for this comprehensive presentation on what the EU regulatory proposal brings to the table. And as you mentioned, it pushes for sustainability, and this is quite a challenge. But let us also hear from another experience, one in the United Kingdom, which, there's a regulation already approved, at the end of 2021 under the environmental bill, and now there's a quest of trying to build the secondary regulation. So let me invite Emily Fripp from EFICA to share more details on that. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Felipe, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. So EFICA, we are providing support. We were the Secretariat for the Global Resource Initiative, where this recommendation for due diligence came from. But we're also the Secretariat for the UK Sustainable Palm and Soya Initiatives. But it's important to note that anything I say today is the views of EFICA and the work we're doing, and I'm not speaking on behalf of our members or UK government. So moving on to the sort of next slide then. So where did this come from? The Global Resource Initiative, there was a task force of independent advisors, came together over a 2-year period, and as part of a package of measures, a sort of interconnected package, made a recommendation that there should be a due diligence obligation placed on companies and also on the finance sector that makes it illegal to import products and sort of products that are derived from commodities that are associated with deforestation. That's where it came from. So moving into what happened next, then on the next slide, the UK made provision in Schedule 17 of the Environment Act that they would move forward with this due diligence regulation and make these provisions. There was a consultation that began last December and ran through till March of this year. So lots of feedback. I think the UK government DEFRA department have received several thousands, I'd say, responses, and they are in the process of consolidating those, working through them, and they'll use those to inform the secondary legislation. And the aim is to lay the secondary legislation as quickly as possible. So they are hoping for this year. Obviously, one of the key points I'm going to flag here is that there is a transition period. It's in the consultation document talks about being a minimum period of 6 months for businesses to prepare. And importantly, there will be guidance. So the devil's going to be in the detail, what's in the guidance, how this works out. We're taking quite a higher level process. I think just to stress, having listened to the European Commission, This is very much focused on legality and less so on the sustainability requirements, although the GRI made it clear that they wanted legal and sustainable. For the UK's position at the moment is to focus on legality. So that's where we stand at the moment. And if we move through, I can run through very quickly some of the key components of it that we've now got. So on the next slide, I can take us through some headlines. So it's about a prohibition on using illegally produced commodities. And that illegality focuses on local laws relating to the ownership and use of land in the production site. Sustainability is outside of scope at the moment. And like I said, there's various reasons for why that is so. The commodities in scope are cattle, beef and leather, so cocoa, coffee, maize, palm oil, rubber and soya. And the businesses in scope, it's aiming for maximum impact, but with minimum regulatory burden. So it's going to be on large businesses, that's the expectation, and that will be defined based on turnover. It could well be that there are several businesses within a supply chain that will all be regulated. There are likely to be exemptions for large businesses that are using a small amount of a particular regulated commodity. If we go to the next slide, please. So the due diligence system is a key component of this, and this will be where companies are obliged to establish and implement a system, and it'll be a system for identifying and obtaining information on this particular commodity, assessing the risk, and then mitigating that risk. There will be a provision for annual reporting. So not all of it, what will be publicly available and not, but there is a desire that annual reports will be produced and that there will be sanctions for failures to comply or obstruction. So these are likely to be fixed monetary penalties, discretionary requirements, perhaps sort of stopping notices and enforcement undertakings. There is also a provision to have periodic reviews of the due diligence system. And if we move into the sort of final slide, sort of talking us through, I mean, I think some of the questions and comments that are going to come up today and discussion are points that we're all talking about in the UK and with our members and with our industry groups. The time frame for the application, we feel there's a clear need to show that all commodities will be covered, and even if that will be staggered, there may be that the legislation, the secondary legislation, is staggered to cover key commodities, 2 or 3 commodities at a time, and then moving forward to other commodities over a 5-year period. But there should be a clear ambition that all commodities are covered. Credible, verifiable evidence. So this is the bit that's the most important. At the moment, the wording is saying to eliminate risk or reduce risk to as low as reasonably practicable. So what does that mean in practice? How will it translate down? Whether we will go to a point in the supply chain, such as the Commission, where there's a geolocation, or will it be based on a regional risk? That's still we've still got to work through the detail of that. There's a clear need to recognise what the industry is already doing and the commitments already made, the progress already made. Traceability requirements should be proportionate to risk, and we should be building on work done in particular, commodity supply chains in particular. Policy alignment's really important as well, both domestically and internationally. We're aware and we're monitoring what's happening in Europe, but also from the US and China, and with producer countries. We need to make sure that we're ensuring consistency, avoiding contradiction, and minimizing administrative burden. And importantly, as the EU is doing, is to look domestically at what we're doing. So making sure our farming practices, our government buying standards, our procurement policies are in line as well and are being consistent. I mean, that's important for all actors in the supply chain to be able to deliver on these commitments. And underpinning all of this, and as was stressed in the package of measures for the GRI made, is that collaboration and partnership with producers is fundamental. There's questions popping up in the chat about sort of illegal deforestation, legally deforestation, all of that. How do you define legality? What's the evidence required? You can't do this alone. We're going to need to work very closely with partners, both producers, civil society, smallholders, governments, to make sure we can effectively implement this. And clearly there is a desire to go beyond legality, to bring it in line with the policies of others, and also to bring it in line with that of corporate commitments. That was my very rapid run through of the position in the UK. Very happy to take questions or follow up afterwards on any additional points. Felipe, that was my rapid run through, so I can hand back to yourself.
Thank you very much, Emily. Extremely interesting and useful. It's clear that a push from the market through the EU and the UK is giving us an opportunity to shape up how conditions to mainstream deforestation-free action in supply chains can be taken to another level. Now, this conversation is not a new conversation in the US. There was a lot of discussion within the context of the Forrest Act as a proposal, but it seems now that the EU and UK processes have provided new wind to this US-driven proposition to see if that can be picked up again and debated in the Congress. For that, I'm going to invite Luke Pritchard to share more about what the opportunity is about. Luke, over to you.
Great, thanks, Felipe, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone out there, depending on where you are. Early morning here in Denver, Colorado. Really want to thank TFA for the opportunity to present today. Personally, I've been a big fan of TFA for many years, and in my previous job, really worked since kind of the inception of TFA on jurisdictional approaches, and now happy to be engaged more with business engagement together with TFA. So I lead our work on Nature and Land at the We Mean Business Coalition. And we've been working over the past several months together with Felipe and the TFA team to try and bring a little more collective coherence to how business is engaging with legislative processes in the US. So I'll speak today primarily on the Forrest Act, which is the federal legislation moving forward, but also touch very briefly on 2 state-level initiatives in California and New York. And I'll run through this pretty quickly. I know we're already a little bit behind time, but there'll also be kind of a readout that will be a little bit more detailed on where we are with these processes that we'll send out after the event today. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, actually we can hop to the next one. Perfect. So I'll start with the Forrest Act. This is kind of the big one that most of you are probably interested in or following because it's the big piece of federal legislation. It's been worked on for many years, but was finally introduced in October 2021. And it's quite similar in its high-level framework with the European legislation, but there are some key differences. One of the key differences is that it seeks to address only illegal deforestation rather than all deforestation. And the initial commodities that are covered are palm oil, soybeans, cattle, cocoa, wood pulp, and rubber, and products derived from those commodities, but that can be changed before the act is passed, and then also through time, there's provisions that would allow additional commodities to be added or removed to that list. Importantly, it establishes a risk-based framework for increasing transparency from companies, and it's really built off of kind of the broad brushes of the framework around the Lacey Act, which is the legislation here in the US to address illegal timber trade. And basically the way this framework works is that the US Trade Representative is tasked with identifying high-risk countries, similar approach to the EU. And then once you're designated as a high-risk country, that's where the requirements for the Forest Act really kick into high gear. And if you are importing any of these commodities from a high-risk country, you have to demonstrate that you've exercised reasonable care to ensure that the products that you're importing are not from illegally deforested land. And the requirements within the Forest Act are that you have to provide traceability and clear evidence of the measures you've taken back to the point of origin. It's the language that they use within the Forest Act. It's actually a bit of a mistake here on the next. It doesn't only apply to high-risk countries, but the traceability requirements, the higher threshold of requirements is only for high-risk countries, although you do have to make a declaration when you import at that port of entry that you've done due diligence, regardless of where you're importing from for those commodities. Importantly, the Forrest Act is not just kind of a stick, but there are also some carrots integrated into it as well. So once you're designated as a high-risk country, then the US will work to develop a action plan, and support will be provided for up to 3 years to get companies on that action plan, which is things like improving governance systems, improving capacity, developing and implementing new laws, so that the country can raise their standards and hopefully eventually be taken off of that high risk list. And so there's both carrots and there's sticks within the Forrest Act. You can hop to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of high level process where we are right now. So some of the challenges with the Forrest Act, and same disclaimer as Emily, I'm not speaking on behalf of companies, I'm not speaking on behalf of the legislators, these are just my personal views, but they're broadly shared by the community generally. We have no Republican co-sponsor in the Senate. We do have a Republican co-sponsor in the House. And I think people recognize that the real priority right now is to secure a Republican co-sponsor in the Senate to have any viability of passing this bill, that this doesn't want to be pushed forward as a partisan effort. So that's really the big focus right now, I think, from the legislators. We're also facing midterm elections here in the United States, and really starting around April, legislation slows down, legislators stop taking risks in the face of their elections, and they focus on their re-election campaigns from now until November. So that's really a big risk to getting the Forrest Act moving over the next few months. We haven't had explicit support from companies either. We've had some really helpful statements, for example, from the companies of the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, but they fall short of saying we want the Forrest Act to pass. That's changing. I think we're going to see some small companies coming out here shortly in support, but I think broadly, we haven't seen that kind of collective weight of companies saying we would like the Forrest Act to move forward. And they do have legitimate questions and concerns. And the question is now, how do we kind of harness the energy and the input from companies to have kind of a coherent message of what needs to be done to the Forrest Act to get industry support? I think based on those bullet points above, there's just general questions about whether or not the Forrest Act is politically viable, and whether it will pass this year. There's also some questions about the implementation of the Forrest Act being really at the port of entry. And so this is implemented essentially by Customs and Border Patrol. And there's some questions if we couldn't take more of a due diligence approach, but nobody has come forward with a proposal of what a due diligence approach would look like in practice that would deliver the same outcomes of the Forrest Act. And then we have this ongoing debate about whether we should be covering illegal versus all deforestation within the Forrest Act. Some opportunities very quickly. Domestically, I think there's more support, for example, from cattlemen in the US and other domestic producers that see this as an opportunity. We will have hearings begin in late spring 2022. Things have been held up as the big focus in the US has been on the Build Back Better plan, but I think we're now seeing that we need to move on, and that'll bring some space, hopefully, for the Forrest Act to breathe a little bit more. The NGO community here in the US is extremely well coordinated and behind the Forrest Act, and are continuing to try and push this forward. There's a huge opportunity to bring more coherence and collective convening from the private sector. We're working on that with TFA. If there's any companies on this call that would like to be part of that dialogue moving forward, please do reach out to myself or to Felipe, and we can see if it would be a good fit to have you as part of that process, which will be kicking off in April. And then there's also synergies with plans from the executive branch, which are also prioritizing commodity-driven deforestation. One last opportunity, which I want to highlight, which isn't on here, is harmonization with the European legislation, which is something that we'll really be focusing on with our dialogue with companies in the next few months. And we can go to the next slide. So just briefly, it's not only federal legislation here in the US, we also have states taking action, principally California and New York, which both over the last 2 months have introduced procurement acts that really focus on the levers that state governments have to address commodity-driven deforestation, which is really focused on their procurement contracts. And so if you are providing contracts that involve the trade of palm oil, soy, beef, leather, paper, coffee, lumber, wood pulp, a few other products, they're a little bit different in the two states, then you have to demonstrate that you have policies and systems in place, that there's no deforestation within those supply chains and in those products that you are providing under those government contracts. The bill actually had already been introduced last year in California. It passed through the assembly, but it was vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom over concerns about how it would impact small and medium enterprises and if they really had the capacity to meet the requirements, or if this would exclude them from procuring or from bidding on government procurement contracts. And so the proponents of the bill are going to be working this year to try and figure out how they revise the language to address those concerns around SMEs. In New York, there's also kind of a sister bill that has been put out that would provide technical support to SMEs to meet the requirements of the act there in New York. And then I'll just close here by saying that I think we're much more likely, especially in California, to see movement this year. I think that the likelihood of success is greater with the state level bills than they probably are with federal bills, but there will still be efforts to convene around the Forrest Act through the end of the year this year. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. Very, very quick and high level overview on these, but as Emily said, happy to answer questions, follow up, and we'll have this process moving forward with TFA as well for companies who would like to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you very much. Yes, as you mentioned, part of our idea with this community call is to share all the different angles that this agenda has, and we invite all in our community to follow through, would be through engagement in the processes that aim to push for ambition and feasibility for these regulatory frameworks, but also for communication, information, and back and forth within the different dynamics and fronts of action. Now, I think, look, you highlighted a very important and relevant element, which is, the importance of subnational processes to advance the agenda forward. Not only within the context, we know about that within the context of producer countries, when we're pushing, jurisdictional work, but it seems that also at the level of policy making, it's important to strategize with those subnational processes that can lead the way forward. Now, as relevant as it is to have that bottom-up approach, we also need to factor in emerging markets. We know that the only way we can really go the extra mile and connect the market forces to the ground is if we can also involve emerging markets. For that, I'm going to call Dr. Chu Kwan-Zu to give a glimpse of how China is going about this topic and the opportunities and challenges that this might bring about. Over to you, Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Philip. It's a great pleasure to share with you about the development of the national strategy in China. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next one. So as you know, like China, under this ecological civilization philosophy, China is in the comprehensive reform of law regulation and institutional development. Actually, China have a high level commitment for addressing this like carbon climate change issue and biodiversity. That's very closely linked with the deforestation issue. At this moment, China have this revised forest law that's included to address this like illegal logging issue and the certification issue, but China do not have a law regulation specifically focused to address this deforestation linked with the soft community trade issue. And as you know, all these like recent developments really show up China's national commitment for the global, like both for climate and biodiversity. And for instance, the EU, China, and the US, China, and also China joined these 140 countries to a declaration and so on. Next one, please. So facilitated with the TFA, and we work with the Ministry of Ecology and the Environment to officially kick off an initiative last year in July to develop a national strategy framework to address this soft community trade issue. And that's officially launched July, and first consultation in September. And the second external consultation will be happens in the following weeks. Next one, please. Thank you. At this moment, the framework of the national strategy already preliminarily developed, and also an internal review on January 28th already being completed. That will focus on many priority, but mainly identify 6 major action tracks. For instance, it established domestic China soft community green value chain management mechanism across different government sectors, and also establish a soft community green value chain management technical supporting system, and also technology innovation demonstration and showcase by the business sectors, and communication and capacity building, and also international cooperation, such as exchange with EU, UK, and the US, and also other supply producer countries. Next one, please. Yeah, just to quickly go through for this timeline. We are targeting to have this national strategy framework and roadmap by before the COP15 second phase that are going to happen in August. And also after that, we will build to the engage different government sectors to buy in, and also develop a policy recommendation for the central government high-level endorsement and announcement. And also, I think this really very critical to get this cross-ministerial ownership, and also supported by the business sectors. Next one, please. Okay, thank you. That's all from me.
Dr. Xu, thank you very much. To our audience, this is a quick glimpse of what's happening, and we wanted you to be aware of all the different processes that are taking place. Of course, as we move forward, we can have dedicated community calls tapping in different of these components, even the producer partnership piece and the engagement with producer regions. So there's just a lot of content. But we thought it was relevant for you to have an idea of all the different building blocks that are taking place. Now, having said that, let's get a perspective from those that have to go through the implementation of the measures that these regulatory frameworks will demand. So let's jump into the panel. Can we have the next slide and just bring to the table Dr. Liz Wilkes, Ilenia Maitino, and Joel Brunen, so that you can share some elements. I'm going to start asking Liz, Liz, from a business perspective, will you please give us your opinion or refer to the pros and cons of a legality-based regulatory approach as the one that Emily shared within the context of the UK. How do you think this helps out or limits the achievement of deforestation-free action?
Well, thank you, Felipe, and thank you for the panelists so far, which is a really great overview from around the globe. And I think it's really good, first of all, to see how each of the different regions are represented, and the things that are similar and different with each of those. From our experience as an Indonesian pulp and paper company, I think to date, the overarching message is that the regulatory mechanism is helping to cut back illegal logging. And I think we have seen that from some of the progress reports from the New York Declaration on Forests. And certainly the current regulation has helped stabilize forestry management and chain of custody system through SVLCAL, which is the Timber Legality Assurance System, which is mandatory by the government of Indonesia. However, different commodities cannot really necessarily be treated all the same. There are different business models for each of those. I think that the regulation is national, at best regional. This can be a benefit if, I think, as we're looking at here today in this forum, that the different regions can be connected in some of those mechanisms and criteria that are being set. There definitely needs to be, I think, within each commodity, there are different standards which are probably in place for each commodity. Based on the pulp and paper industry, we've had standards which have been in place for over 30 years in international and sustainable forestry management, as well as chain of custody standards. And these actually have formed some of the, the due diligence for some of the regulations that are currently in place and reassurance. So I think the mechanisms to support regulation is really critical. Resources mentioned by Helga, which I think is really critical as well. And I'm glad to see that, because certainly there needs to be resource in place to check some of those things in terms of the mechanisms. Promotion and awareness is crucial from the demand side. SMEs is critical, industry with brands and retailers, and also government. But regulation does take time. It may be quite quick to write and publish, but it does take time to implement. And I think certainly from our own experience with the mutual recognition on producer countries has been really key with the legality approach, both at origin and at source. And this has been demonstrated between the UK and Indonesia, where certainly DEFRA and DFID have provided that support. APP was one of the sponsors to the FLEGT process right at the beginning. So definitely cooperation and support is key. Satellite imagery, I think, is important in terms of that monitoring and measuring. But one of my bugbears, which I really would like to say before, because it's been quite a long-winded answer, but there's a lot to cover, as you say, Felipe. Certainly, I think it's important and crucial to take the community with you in the process. And I think this is not something that's always covered by the regulation. Certainly for us through, a pilot, socialization and training, even if the community is not part of the core business model, which for us actually it isn't. The pulp and paper industry is not based on small farm holders, but our business does depend on the raw materials for our products in the landscape, and therefore it is key to balance conservation and production and the community together. And certainly for us, one of our flagship projects, which came actually as a result of the EUTR, was the unintended consequence of sustainable livelihoods. There was a need for us to develop projects for communities in and around our concession areas. And certainly that we have seen really key in terms of tackling deforestation, in helping to reduce the risk of fire, illegal logging and land disputes. I think we're currently running at about over 30,000 households that have been part of this program, and we hope to run more of those. So I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer, but we've been on a long journey to get here. This is only the experience from the pulp and paper industry. It's been my life's experience over nearly 30 years as well, beyond Asia Pulp and Paper, and as a visiting professor in sustainability. Very interested in how standards play a key role with regulatory frameworks, but again, one size does not fit all. So very interested to see how that will come through, in the detail of the due diligence mechanisms for the regulations that are happening around the world.
Thank you very much, Liz. I think that's extremely useful. There's no black and whites, and definitely, there's a dynamic in which you have to set up standards and then have, innovation push forward and create a upgrowing spiral that leads us towards fulfilling our goals. For that, corporate engagement and corporate leadership is essential. So thanks for reminding what that means. And as you say, it's not something that you just do overnight. Now, I'm going to jump to Ilenia. Ms. Ziegler talked about, the EU approach trying to aspire towards this, more systemic change, and that's what she refers to as a sustainability approach. Although, as it has been flagged in the chat, sustainability is quite a complex word, right? It encompasses enormous levels of actions. Of course, we're talking more specifically about trying to really achieve deforestation and degradation-free action on the ground beyond legality. Now, from your perspective, from the sector that you represent, what do you think is required for the EU process to effectively help reduce this deforestation on the ground and avoid potential leakages to the emerging markets?
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you for the invitation to today's discussion. It's been very interesting so far. Before I answer your question, maybe if I can also jump into the previous question and in terms of pro and cons of a regulatory approach when it comes to deforestation-free supply chain. When it comes to the EU market, which is where I'm currently based on and I'm more following from a regulatory perspective, we believe that having an EU harmonized framework is really the right approach forward, and for different reasons. First of all, to guarantee a level playing field and legal certainty for operators, but also to really try to step up the EU role and approach to reach out more operators and ultimately widen the action towards that systemic change that you just mentioned in your question. Perhaps not the real cons, but just maybe a watch out also as a message to the EU institutions is really to try to avoid running the risk of going in a direction of a one-size-fits-all approach, because we believe that this will not maximize the efficiency of the regulation, and this considering all the specificities of each supply chain, which will be important to reflect also in the final draft of the regulation. When it comes to your specific question, Felipe, so if we think about how the EU approach could maximize really its efficiency in reaching the aims of the regulation, I think that the key word that comes to my mind is really about engagement. It's been mentioned also by previous speakers, but it's really, really important. And when we think about engagement at Ferrero, we at the moment and towards this regulation, we really interpret it in different levels, engagement at different levels. So first of all, engagement with our suppliers. And here you can directly see a link with the importance of reinforced and strict traceability requirements. These two have visibility and really knowing your supply chain. Why this is important? Because on one hand, it helps you identifying risks. And once these risks are identified, it helps you really engaging with the suppliers rather than just abandon them, but engage with them and see how to bring them on board towards a more sustainable journey. And this eventually, can reduce the risks of leakage to emerging markets. Of course, when it comes to traceability requirements, what will be very important to do is really to strike a balance between the need of, maintaining these requirements for the reason we just said, but also trying to provide some specific tools and action to scale up those requirements, and so help also smaller operators in the value chain to be able to face those challenges and deliver on these requirements. Then also engagement with producing countries. This is a key level of engagement for us. We see that it's very, very important to bring origin countries along the journey, and this through partnership agreements between them and the EU. Those partnership agreements will have the way of, let's say, gathering together all the relevant stakeholders, so from governmental institutions, but also local communities, farmers, civil societies, local operators on the ground, with the objective to try to identify and clarify what's needed, what are the tangible actions that really can deliver on impact and that can be implemented, and then perhaps together also establish supporting mechanisms, so financial aid, technical expertise, and so on, and to really have a clear time-bound framework for action to really deliver on those enabling conditions that ultimately form a very, very important part of the equation. We hear many talking about it, but in reality, we see little moving. There has been some movements in the cocoa sector at EU level, which was very positive, we think. And it would be great if this could also be, let's say, extended to other key ingredients. So, for example, for palm oil, this is very important, and we have highlighted some of these elements. So, not just these are just, I mean, are for Ferrero points of view, but some of these elements have also been shared with peers and some civil society organizations here in Brussels through this COCO coalition that the representative from the European Commission also mentioned before, an informal coalition that really tried to put together some key elements, for example, for the cocoa sector in this case.
Thank you very much, Lenia. That's extremely useful and insightful. You know, market forces making an effect on the ground. You know, for that, there's a long way across those supply chains, which are quite complex. And there's this question of how do we trace this out, and how do we make sure that this comes to the last mile. For that, let me invite Joel to you know, give insight. You know, Joel, you know, there's an open discussion about this push for traceability system as a needed element to assure effectiveness of the regulatory frameworks. But at the same time, that this could represent a menace in terms of smallholder engagement, that it could leave many smallholders out of the supply chains because they don't have the means to really deploy what these traceability requirements could look like. Speaking out from your experience on the ground, can this challenge be transformed into an opportunity? And if yes, some ideas on how this can happen?
Well, buenos dias, Felipe, and thank you for facilitating this conversation between the perspectives from developed markets and emerging markets. To respond to your question, I would like to give you the perspective of one of the key tropical forest countries, Colombia. So traceability is now a tool for meeting the expectations of buyers and end users, and for assuring them that a producer is indeed meeting their requirements. But what benefits does it offer to the producers? This question is relevant because products like palm oil, coffee, and cocoa are predominantly produced by smallholders. And there are two key questions when applying traceability. What costs are we willing to assume to ensure traceability, and who will bear them? And two, what's in it for the producer when delivering data for this tool? So depending on the type of traceability, the cost and level of complexity vary. There are basically three prevailing types of traceability: product segregation, mass balance, and book and claim. The first one is the most expensive one, and likely not easy to mainstream for regulatory frameworks. The other two are more viable options when using regulatory frameworks, since you need to cover large volumes. So turning traceability for smallholders into opportunity is not just about the system and tools used, but also about the transaction costs and incentives at play. Policymakers and corporates must contend a range of factors, including such as determining the real cost of implementing traceability system, including the monetary and non-monetary transaction costs and new skills required by smallholders, and identifying who will pay for what aspects of traceability in the short term and long term, but also specifying what incentives are needed to drive the uptake of traceability systems. And last but not least, understanding what disincentives and risk might slow or frustrate the uptake. To give you a concrete example of the palm oil supply chain in Colombia, the system Palm Trace allows the industry to track the product up to the processing mill. However, the main challenge is the so-called last mile. So you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of smallholders that deliver to the processing mills that are not part of this traceability system. To include palm oil smallholders, you need to offer them something to make it attractive, deliver their production and farm data to these types of tools. So the opportunity lies in turning their data into value and insights for improvements, not as a way to judge them on their compliance, so less of a police approach, much more of a doctor approach. So for continuous improvement, you need to provide also the resources, what already mentioned by a few panelists, technical assistance and training to smallholders.
Thank you very much. That's extremely useful. And basically, you're highlighting all these elements that should accompany a regulatory framework. Good incentives, effective traceability that's really can help out engage stakeholders, a good balanced field, even, why not, the connection to the financial world. And I think, let me turn it over. Well, first I want to thank Lise, Ilenia, and Joel for this contribution, and definitely we have to have a follow-up conversation to highlight some of these elements. But with that, I'm going to close this panel and want to turn it over to Helge Sittler. Helge, building on what Joel was mentioning, the EU is pushing hard to really make sure that the communication to tackle deforestation encompasses many of these elements. The regulatory framework is just one piece, and there's many other elements that come about. Even for the multi-stakeholder community, we've talked about, a smart mix of measures to be able to achieve our goal. And as you can see, there's also this dynamic beyond the EU borders with other markets, with producer countries, that allows us to really make sure this is an opportunity to capitalize, or to make sure we make the most out of that. Based on what you've heard today, could you please share some closing remarks of the road forward? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and this has been really interesting. I'm also still, I have to admit, quite new on the file, and I continue to learn by listening to these comments and presentations. And also just to say that, we are happy if there are specific questions that we have not addressed now from the chat to come back to you. But to pick up on your last point, indeed, I think conversations like this one are really important, because I think it shows that we are all trying to move, I think, to the same objectives, but we need more dialogue on the best ways forward. And that's also why this kind of events, but really also at the government level, the conversations in different fora are absolutely crucial. So we are trying to have these topics addressed in bilateral dialogues. We certainly put this issue on the agenda in all our environmental, trade, etc. dialogues with other key countries and markets. We also see more interest on the sustainable agricultural supply chains in the context of the G7, and we certainly also would like to see that in the G20 context. I think it's very good also listening to the developments in the US, where I think it's a very difficult national context. I've been living in the US in the last 3 years, and I've really seen how complex it is to get any legislation through. But there is, I think, a lot of dynamic and thinking there also with this new commitment of the Biden administration on the climate objectives. We've seen the topic on the agenda of the Major Economies Forum. We don't know exactly yet what colleagues from the US have in mind there, but it's certainly a forum that we would consider very interesting for more dialogue amongst consumers in the context of a climate ambition. The UK colleagues have been fantastic in drawing attention to the importance of forest in the climate context in Glasgow. Really, that has created momentum, and the FACT dialogues now the follow-up tries to take this forward, and that is also an important avenue to explore, and many others. And I think that's really the way, because we see that certain things, I guess, are already quite similar. We see the commodities that are being identified to a large extent overlap. What are the key commodities that need to be addressed? Some differences here and there. On our end, certainly this can also, we have a progressive scope development foreseen, and we also know that the European Parliament has views, so we will see how this will look like at the very end. We also see, at least in the UK and in the EU, the identification of due diligence approaches as the best way forward. But then, of course, quite significant differences still, whether to go beyond legality. From our perspective, and just looking at figures, I looked at figures again. At the current current data says, for example, level of legal deforestation is 74% in Ivory Coast, it's 63% in Vietnam, and so on. So from our perspective, this is just such a clear signal that just looking at legality cannot help us to really tackle the core of the issue. So we need to go beyond that, because we've also seen that, of course, there's a certain risk of just, I mean, taking to an extreme, one could just declare deforesting the Amazon legal, and then here we go. I mean, this just is a very problematic avenue, and we just think we need to move beyond that. And from our perspective, certainly, we are very happy to have very open dialogues on this with all the other partners, and to see that also in these fora that I mentioned, like FACT Dialogue about Major Economies Forum, we can have these conversations why we really consider this an absolutely indispensable element. And then, of course, the other question is due diligence. What level of ambition do we want to put? Again, from our perspective, strict traceability is essential, and just to react on that point about mass balance, I mean, this just wouldn't exclude the risk of, in the end, a lot of products stemming from deforested land ending up on the EU market. And that is exactly something that we want to avoid with our legislation. And so mass balance just cannot get us to reach our objectives, and we have to go further, and we have to look at individual shipments and have the traceability there. We've seen that this is possible. We've also seen in the timber regulation that this is possible for SMEs. So with that, we would also encourage all other regulatory approaches to really take a broad approach and not to limit themselves to big companies only. Certainly, fully acknowledge that supply chains in the different sectors work differently to some extent. And that is something that one could look at once we come to the implementation phase, whether there can be sector-specific guidance documents and so on. I mean, that's something we realize, of course, as well, but certain core elements we feel need to be in the primary legislation. Otherwise, we don't have a level playing field, and we cannot have the core elements of legal certainty right up front in the regulation itself. So that is something we consider really important. Well, there were many other questions that I could try to react to. Just the last point, maybe to pick up that I think it's absolutely essential what many of you have said. Everybody needs to be committed and needs to be there, and it needs engagement and awareness in the business sector, but of course also that needs a lot of support and skill training and capacity building for all. Again, we have dialogues also with smallholders, and we just had recently feedback from discussions with smallholders in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, in the cocoa sector, and they also see it as an opportunity. So it requires investment from all, from the producer side, from the countryside through development support, but it's also an opportunity. And I think having not tougher requirements on traceability for high-risk countries also creates a fairer level for all, because otherwise you really risk diverting trade flows very much to all those that are low-risk countries. And I think that would really run counter to a lot of our development objectives, because not every smallholder is responsible for governments that allow for high deforestation levels. And so we should really try to keep trade flows open to enable everyone, even if it's from a high-risk countries, to bring their products to the EU market. And that's why we would like to have as a baseline the same traceability requirements for everyone, even though then other things will be simplified, like reporting requirements and so on. So I will leave it at that. It's a very rich discussion, so many things that could be addressed. But again, many thanks to TFA for organizing this, and looking forward to continue the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helge, and I want to thank the speakers and the panelists for their insight. It's indeed a very rich discussion. A couple of final thoughts from our end, and building on what Helge mentioned, this is not isolated, right? This is an agenda looking at trade and commodities and their impact to deforestation, which is also framed within broader conversations that have to do with the climate change discussions and goals that we have set up under the Paris Agreement globally. but also in the negotiation of the post-2020 framework for biodiversity, meaning, the level of ambition, the goal has been set up. We're not going to change that out. It's how we really build the structures to achieve that. And then secondly, Helge, you mentioned dialogue. The way to accelerate this is to have effective dialogue, effective conduits. I think us from the Tropical Forest Alliance are trying to partner around with the community to make sure that we can bring, leading multi-stakeholder input into the space, emphasize on corporate leadership more than ever. This is the moment where corporate leadership has to step up and demonstrate that the commitments are for real and that we can really mainstream good practices. Yes, there's a need to innovate. There's a need to change business models. But for that, as we heard from Joel in Colombia, why don't we develop those other complementary incentives? This is where the producer partnership piece comes about, and make sure that we can really bring traceability to the ground, do it in a way that smallholder engagement gets factored in, and capitalize the opportunity that 2022 is putting us in front of. So with that, I'll conclude this session, the community call, and let's leave it as a call for action, collective action. I want to thank again our speakers, our panelists, and especially our audience, which is, you're the community that can make this happen. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.